and I think Candace Owens said this, and I know people are going to love this because I get compared to her all the time, is that uh, Black Americans are the most privileged Black people. And I would be open to hearing about more systemic racism, but the only form that I can confidently say is that in the universities where they're specifically saying we're not going to take these Asian students, we're not going to take these white students because we need to reach a certain quota.
There's a reason why we said that people are innocent until proven guilty, even though we know that's not always the case, specifically when it comes to Black folks in this country, but that's a whole other conversation.
I don't think it's feasible to get mad at society for perceiving people in a certain way when they've already been spoon-fed stereotypes. I want to talk about reparations, because you mentioned something when I was asking you about like the progressive aspect and how you don't feel like people should, if it's an old person that can't work for themselves, they can't take for themselves. I totally get that, and I believe that there should be some type of safety net to help people that legitimately cannot help themselves. But my problem comes from the fact that unfortunately, there are so many people out there that will play the game. They'll play with the system, and they'll just be people that just simply don't want to work or feel like they can't work. And then it incentivizes people to work. Like, for example, what the welfare state does to the Black community, or is still doing to the Black community. Right. So my question is when, in what context do we need reparations? Because when I hear reparations, I hear an excuse for people to get free money when they don't necessarily need it.
Okay. So I always like to focus on reparations on specific things. For example, the country has already done reparations on several occasions. One such occasion was the Japanese in internment camps, right? Like during World War One, I believe it was, or World War Two, excuse me. During that, like we decided that something happened where the government decided to treat every Japanese American as if they were hostile to the United States and put them in internment camps. They lost their homes, they lost all of these things. And in those cases, the government recognizes that it did something incredibly harmful. And so then when they finally let them out, like these people had to start their lives over. Some of them lost their businesses and their houses and their livelihoods and things like that. The government recognizes this was wrong, what we did. So we should probably pay reparations. And so they ended up paying out money towards those individuals whom they had harmed, who had lost their businesses, who had spent at least a year inside of these internment camps. That's a type of reparations. Do you feel like that type of reparations is appropriate?
Before I answer that, those type of reparations, what is the span of time between the incident to when they actually get the paycheck?
In the Japanese internment camps, it was 40 years.
40 years. My perspective is, this is going to be a very harsh perspective, is that in 40 years' time, you should be able to pick yourself up. Sure. You should be able to keep going. And I think in that context of reparations, where it's such a long time, that opens the possibility for people to say, what about me? I was also there. Like, for example, Black Lives Matter. I saw so many people out in the streets, young people, complaining about reparations when they're like 16. Reparations from what? And now the debate was, now we got to prove that I am a descendant of slavery to get this paycheck.
Wait, that's way broader, right? Because like, there are so many different things you could do reparations for, but like that's just one specific example. And what we see as the way it played out, it didn't open up the door for a bunch of people to then lie and imply that they had been there. For the people who it was paid out to were people who had been directly inside of those internment camps. It wasn't that every Japanese American, right? There were still Japanese immigrants that came to the country. We didn't extend it to Chinese Americans or other types of Americans. We gave it out to the people who were who had been in those internment camps. And I think reparations serves as multiple functions. It's not just about like, oh, since you lost your livelihood, we're going to give you a livelihood back. Sometimes it's something done by the government, because if we're a government that tries to be a moral compass, right? Because we are that, and very often we are enforcing our our moral system and our moral beliefs and things on the rest of the world. We do that. Imperialism is something that the United States has engaged in since I mean, for God knows how long, right? So then, if we're going to do that, then I do think that the government has an obligation to make sure that it's holding true to the standards set forth within the preamble in the Constitution, and the values that the average American has. And I think everyone kind of gets behind the idea of, if you've done wrong, do restitution for that wrong. And sometimes, even if a person is able to succeed despite the wrong that you did to them, it does show a good faith effort as a country to recognize its wrongs and therefore to move forward. Because we do want patriotism within the country. We still want people to register for our military. We have a very powerful country and we probably need to defend it. There are plenty of enemies that America has made and some people who are just whatever, hating. So at the end of the day, the idea that we would probably want to encourage, because of the values, the melting pot of this country, we wouldn't want to have a stain like what we did to Japan, like still resting on us, and then and so that no more Japanese immigrants are willing to come, or the Japanese immigrants who do come always have a huge portion of them that is completely resistant to the American way and resistance to the American dream and to the American government and the American country and American people, right? Because some people are not going to completely divorce the country and the government from its people, right? Because it's supposed to be a democracy by the people for the people. So I think the reparations have a really good job in helping people to recognize that, yes, this was wrong. It helps to validate these people that, yes, this thing was wrong. And it also helps to demonstrate that the government and the country is working in a good faith effort to right the wrongs that it did.
Right.
Hmm.
So this is more of not even so much economically, it's just more of like the message. It's
It's
just more of kind of
both.
like
It's
when it comes
both.
social, well, it's both. Well, I mean,
Yeah.
we can't just say everyone's black experience is the same. Let's just say like even what you're doing right now for a living, like I mean, when you come to people where it's just like that were directly affected by those camps and they got those people and they got the reparations. I'm talking about like where we are right now as a society. I
Hmm.
understand that we have like different backgrounds, but honestly, the way that things are now, where when it comes to making money or just being, just something in your life in America, it's drastically different than when we were black, like let's just say decades back before. So
Sure.
when you're doing it now, it's more of like just it's more of a message like here, we want to right some wrongs and whatnot. But let's just say, because to me, when I put it like culturally, I don't think it would change anything because there's already people that believe that. When you put like reparations, I don't think it will be the end there. Even though we do have a lot of things where let's be real, like if you were to just say, because I believe in a thing called black privilege, that's a thing. Let's be real, like that is especially now when it came from like the BLM movement, and I just don't see that really so much helping anything. And like, let's just say if you were to do something like, do you have an idea in your head like where it would specifically go? Would it be like maybe spat black people specifically in certain areas, or like where it's crime ridden, or where it's more poor, which tends to be blue states? So like exactly how would that go about? Like I just don't see that being like a one and done thing. Here, your like your ancestors, they suffered this, we accumulated a number or a weekly payment for you for that not happening to you. I just want to know like how would that help out with anything, and
Sure.
without that causing like any vitriol.
It shouldn't. So I think you do specific things. We do reparations in various ways. One of the things that I obviously advocate for pretty frequently is the reparations for the GI Bill. I'm pretty sure you guys know what the GI Bill is, and I'm pretty sure you guys both recognize the benefit of it, right? When people go off and like register to fight our country's wars and to defend our country in the military, like that is like sometimes 4 to 8 years where you are enlisted just as someone who is a tool, if you will, of our government. Not to be crass, but it's a very honorable thing to do. But living in that lifestyle and then coming back to the United States after fighting in these wars and being a soldier and not having gone to school like the people who didn't go, register, not having like worked a job, a regular job, or anything that's like part of that you there's something that's needed in order for you to be able to assimilate back into society. So we came up with a thing called the GI Bill. I've never heard of any person really complaining about the GI Bill. But if I point out to you that the GI Bill was almost exclusively given to white people, despite the fact that black people were also in the armed forces, and we can see that there's direct harm that's been done to these individuals who were in the armed forces, and we can see that the lifestyles and the livelihoods of the individuals who had access to GI Bills so that they could end up buying property, so that they could end up getting an education. When we see that these lifestyles, I mean, their livelihoods are dramatically different. Their wealth their lifetime wealth, the inheritance they leave to their children, the schools that their children are able to attend. College and real estate, like education and real estate, are two of the biggest factors leading towards like lifetime wealth. And if we see that we denied this thing to Black people, then I would say that's a specific form of reparations that should be given to all of the people that we have documented evidence that they were denied the GI Bill, right? Like that's a specific thing. I feel like
Were they
very often,
denied the GI Bill because of their race, though? Like,
specifically because of their race. Specifically, we have
how do we
evidence
know
to
this?
support that. So obviously, we've done all of these different studies in which where, like in different states, I forget, in some of the states, like Mississippi, I want to say Mississippi was one of them. I think they said less than 1% of the GI Bill went to Black people, and they were applying. They applied for the GI Bill and were just denied, right? So there were different problems that were associated with it. For one, in order to use the GI Bill, you needed to get loans and things like that. And then those people weren't able to get loans because of the fact that they were Black, and those they were just not given.
Well, hold on though. How do you prove that? You know,
There,
like how do you a problem that I find with a lot of statistics that people, for example, the police brutality statistics that we kept hearing about, and how a
Mhm,
certain percentage of Black people get gunned down more than white people, and how
mhm.
that automatically means that it is attributed because of their skin color. Like, how do we prove that the reason they got denied blank was specifically because you're a Negro and I don't want to give it to you?
I
Like, how do
got
we
you.
know?
It's really simple. So you look for two people who have similar situations. I don't know, maybe like having never worked a job, having never been to school, not really been spending the 8 years from the time you were 18 until you were 26, or 18 until 22. And when you got out of the military, you guys are similarly situated and you both applied for the GI Bill, but only one of you guys got it and the other one was just declined. And when you can see that pattern happening consistently, then you start to recognize like, this thing has been just not given, right? Like it just hasn't happened. In the same sense, the way that we end up determining the way redlining happened, right? Like, or you look
I
at,
disagree with that.
wait, so you
I
think
disagree
that,
with
so
that.
you think that what you're saying, if we take similarly situated individuals and that they both apply for something, and we're able to determine based on the data that Black people who are similarly situated to white people are being denied the exact same benefits, that you would not conclude that race was the factor?
Correct. I would not. It could be a possibility, but I don't think that that explains all of the possible hypothesis of why that person gets denied. Because here's some other factors that I've seen a lot with people in the Black community is personality, attitude. That's something that a lot of people don't take into consideration. So when I go and I try to apply for a job, if I went in there with an attitude that did not vibe with whoever was hiring me, or I had a personality that would not mesh well with that place of employment, that would be another reason for me not to get that. Maybe my work ethic isn't the same. Maybe I have different goals that I want to achieve, and that can be a good measurement of determining whether or not this person wants to invest in me if I'm going to end up leaving a year from now. Like, there's other reasons, and I think that automatically jumping to something that we see as just visual, black and white, exacerbates this idea of racism, and really, I think, keeping racism alive for the end of time, because it's this instant, it must be because of their skin color, when we know not everyone has pleasant personalities, for example.
Okay, but so there's two things. When you're applying for a job, there's already a humongous study that was done that like showed about callback rates when it comes to
Yeah,
applications.
like Black names
I
on
gotta clap it.
resumes.
Right.
I got
Oh,
something for you right there. I got
okay,
some.
but let me finish it really quick just to make
Yeah.
sure it's purely stated. So then, like, the idea is a lot of times when it comes to like loan applications and when it comes to like job applications, there's no attitude on a loan application or a job application. All they have is a piece of paper in front of them. And so I think that that sort of thing right there is where you would demonstrate it. And then furthermore, I don't I, like I guess, hmm, people, I'm not a person who runs these studies or a person that does these studies, but I've never really seen these studies actually being challenged. And I would imagine, like, unless that we're going to think that there's some sort of confine that's so painfully obvious that somehow that the people who are running the studies just missed, but you're right here just able to come up with it off of the top of your head that, hey, here's a confine that they just must not have thought of. I think, yeah, I don't know, that seems kind of
But you were just
uncharitable.
resorting to color. It's like because it's black for sure.
Wait,
I
I'm
also
not just
just
no
want
no
to know
no.
something really quick. All right, yeah, go.
It's not just because they're black. The way you would control for that is to make sure that they're similarly situated. So in other words, if we find this is a person who has no job history, right? Who they've literally enlisted from the time they were 17 years old and they went off to fight our war. Now they've come back. They're 21 years old. Neither one of them have job history. They both filled out a job application. The white guy got it, but the black guy didn't. Now, if they're similarly situated, explain to me what would be another confine in that situation that would make sense for why the black people, I'm sorry, across the board were denied, yet the white people were able to receive it.
Yeah, I don't know much about the GI Bill specifically, so I'd have to think about it and make a list. But my point is that I think that there are other factors that could explain why someone isn't going to get something. You mentioned before, because I know you want to say more before I was gonna bring something else up.
No, it's mostly going to be on what the messaging. I'm really when it comes to even like with these issues, when it comes to let's just say culturally or just like racial injustice, have you will, or with the way that the U.S. has done these wrongdoings like slavery, like racism. It's yes, it's been a rule of a lot of things, but though it's to me, it comes from a lot when it comes to perspective on where you believe where you are now. I wanted to ask more on when it comes to what you think literally like if we were to do a more recent like now reparations, what the message would be. To me, it's gonna be kind of like a couple of parts. So are you sure you want to ask like your stuff
No,
first?
I wanted to bring up because you mentioned something
Yeah,
about
you
a
may.
study with black sounding names and how they don't get callbacks
50%
and
less
Interesting.
callback rate, yeah.
Yeah.
less callbacks, right? I'm gonna use an analogy really quickly, and um shit, I've already had a brain fart. Shit, I knew it was gonna happen. Damn it! I always have brain farts on this stream.
I just
That
let it go
happens to
first.
me as
But
well.
no, it's fine. It happens. It happens.
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. So in the trans movement, we're gonna skip just to make this analogy. In the trans movement, there are a lot of people that want to change the way that society perceives them. So, in the sense that if someone who is visibly a male just slaps on the dress, they want to be addressed as a woman, even though they clearly don't look visibly like a woman. So, and then they'll get angry because the world doesn't perceive them in that way. And
Mhm.
my thought when I see situations like that, which is very prominent, is that, well, if you know that the general consensus is blank and you're getting friction for presenting yourself as a female when you're not going all the way, essentially, then what is the end goal? Because you can't change the way that society perceives you. So, back to the black sounding names. There is this trend in the black community of naming children bizarre names. Shaquina, Latifah, Laquanda, whatever, Shania, I don't know, lots of names. And as much as it is the parents' freedom to name their child whatever, it's also there. I think there should be some level of accountability for that parent, knowing that I'm going to give this child a name that might feed into a stereotype. And if people are already watching mainstream media or they're getting this sense of like gang violence in the black community or like, living the thug life or whatever, and then they start to pick pieces off of culture, they're going to build an idea in their head of what this applicant is like just based on the name alone. I think that's what I see. So so when it comes down to these situations, it's like, well, first of all, there's other jobs out there. If you get denied a job for your black sounding name, there's another job out there. Doesn't mean that it's right, but you got to keep going and you got to find another job. I've been denied jobs for stupid reasons
Because you're black.
because I don't know if it's because I'm black. Maybe I don't know. I don't know what the reasons were, but but that's what I'm saying is like you keep going, you keep moving on. But if the fact is that a person keeps receiving friction and they believe it's because of their black sounding name, the solution to me would be to pave your own way, start entrepreneurship, start your own thing, or change your name, because I don't think it's feasible to get mad at society for perceiving people in a certain way when they've already been spoon-fed stereotypes.
All right, there's plenty wrong with that, right? So, like,
Okay.
basically, what you're doing, it sounds like what you're doing is racist apologia, right? And the reason why I say that, and this is not like a gotcha, but it's this: if you're basically saying people are building an idea in their head about what a person is like is going to be like based on their name alone, right? Which the name, the only thing that they're getting from that is probably the affiliation with a person being black. You're basically saying people are going to be racist because if my name alone tells you that I'm black, and then the fact that I'm black alone tells you about who I am, then that means that's race essentialism. You're basically saying that my race is determined, that all of these characteristics can readily be associated with me simply because I'm black. That's clearly problematic. So we as a society have every right to be angry at that because we've obviously seen some of the harm and degradation that has on people for what for the way for outcomes, right, for normative outcomes for different people based on like public perception and based on racism, right? And then also I would say that yes, you can obviously argue that for some people that they can make the decision, that they should make the decision. I believe that children are the future, right, to quote Whitney Houston. And so I think that you probably need to make sure that you're naming your children or doing things in a way such as to provide your children with the best benefit for the best chance for success. Now that is a form of compromise to basically say that I will deny some function or some portion of my ethnicity in order to assimilate with white culture. That sounds like white supremacist ideology, the idea that we have to assimilate with white culture or white names in order to be able to function in a society that's supposed to be equal and give treatment to all people, right? Like that's what you're basically saying here. Now I would never argue it. For example, my siblings and myself, we have regular sounding names. I get regular, and I feel like even that could be whatever it is, right? Like we all have like names that aren't immediately going to be associated with blackness. I don't think my mother did that in order to distance herself from blackness or anything like that. It's just these were the names that she found pretty, and so that's what she named us. They were mostly biblical. Like that's a thing that you can tell people. This is something I advise that you do while simultaneously condemning the society that normalizes people to come to ridiculous assumptions about people just based on their race. That's by definition racism.
So I'm gonna push back on you on that because I don't think it's racist, and I also would say that you can't legislate the end of racism. I believe that racism is a myth. I treat racism in the same. I think there's a difference between racism and discrimination, saying that you are black and therefore because you're black, I don't want to give you this job. But what you're describing is still a feeling. Like it could still be X, Y, and Z of why they didn't get this job because the common denominator is they have black sounding names. That is a reason. And I personally feel that's a way to victimize oneself instead of saying, okay, I didn't get this job, on to the next one. Let's apply for another one. And I think that does more harm to the black community by enabling this victimhood mindset instead of saying, you know what, you didn't get the job. This is life. You're not always going to get the jobs that you want. So let's figure out what you can do to get that job. I have a hard time believing that if I had a black sounding name and I went to a job and I got denied, that I would continuously keep getting denied at every job. I'm not being an apologist. I'm just stating the reality that people will think about stereotypes. And if stereotypes are such an issue to a specific demographic, then that demographic, I believe, should be working to eradicate those stereotypes. Okay, this is a harmful stereotype. Where did the stereotype come from? Why is it here? I'm sure we can agree that there's some things in like Black America that aren't good. Gang violence being one of them, gang banging, and like the rappers that we have that are promoting this shit. I don't think that's healthy for society. But when someone assumes that they see someone with their pants sagging down, they see grills in their mouth, and they assume that's a gang banger or that's a rapper, where did they get that perception from? Is it racist, or are people handing the stereotype to someone else and expecting them to see something different?
Well, okay, so there's a few things. One, you're saying it's not talking about a feeling. The purpose of data is specifically to eradicate feelings. People can feel like maybe they're being denied because they're black, but we wouldn't know it unless we go ahead and do something where we do the largest study of its kind and where we get like 3,300 applications and we make them almost identical, and the only differing thing is someone's name. So then that way we can actually give them to jobs and we start to find their callback rates. Now, guess what? That study only stopped at names, right? So like that's enough to discourage people, not like in person. So you can't blame it on attitude, right? We got to move it now and say, okay, well, so is it the tone of their voice? Nope, these are just applications. So this is before they even get a call back, right? So now we can say this is clearly a problem. Furthermore, right, it's a 50% minus callback. So that means that these people can continue to work and they will eventually find a job. But we obviously recognize that any sort of barrier affects normative outcomes. We can't say at the same time, or I'm sorry, we should be able to recognize that, like, hey, if this is something, just because this barrier isn't 100% preventing you from all avenues of success, that doesn't mean that it's not something that should be like still like we should be getting around it, right? So, furthermore, you said racism is a myth. I don't know what that means. Racism is a belief that black people are inherently inferior. Or, I'm sorry, that race has essential functions, and those essential functions create disparities in which one race would be, or some races would be inferior, right? Inferior or
How? What?
superior to
Like,
one another's.
elaborate.
That's the
So you're
definition.
saying it's
So
like the same brought across? I'm sorry. Well, I want to ask it to be different, but you can
Do you
go
want? Did you
down
want to
this.
follow up or?
No, I mean, just even before even going into that, like, how old was the study, by the way? I want to ask another question after that.
I know the oldest one was done. I don't know actually. I want to say it was done in like 2012 or something like that. I believe
2012.
that's when it
Okay.
was.
Because
Yeah.
like I'm just more of a fan of just like now, with things just going on now. I know that we can make arguments with everything that's happened back then. I just kind of just get a little impatient. So
Back
let's
then,
just say
10 years
like
ago
right
is
now.
back then.
No, I'm just asking you right now. Do you
Okay.
think like just doing this study right now, do you think it would be the same result?
I think it'd be pretty similar. Yes.
Why?
Well, because there was also another study that was done in Arizona that I think that was like about 2 years ago, in which they were
Mhm.
finding that like black inmates were being penalized like way worse than white inmates. I'm sorry, white. What do you call them? White ex-convicts were being penalized significantly harder than black ex-convicts. Right? There's plenty of studies based on current data, like now, that we can see where these things happen. And then furthermore, like unless we see some sort of thing that would demonstrate some sort of attenuance of these things, I don't understand why we would automatically assume that things have changed dramatically in literally only 10 years that would somehow result in some crazy disparities from like the actual data that we have.
I just think that there are so many successful black people in America, and I have to say America because being a YouTuber gives me a bigger perspective on the world and how other cultures are. And I'll get a lot of people in like Nigeria that will talk about how Black Americans constantly victimize themselves and they don't know why. And I think that with all of the successful Black people in America, focusing on this small sector of people that have African sounding names and how they're not able to get a job or get whatever they need to do because it is being assumed that it's due to their name, I don't think that's constructive. I think that is instead of celebrating and helping more people succeed, we're focusing on this small sector that's named crazy names, but I think that that is unfortunately are just a result of just your name. Like if we wanted to go with that, if the reality is that it's their name that's preventing them from these things, then what are your options, right? I care more about solutions. The solution is to keep trying to find another job or change your name. There's no other solution.
Wait, but there's plenty of other solutions. I think first off, the purpose of data is in order to be able to educate yourself so then you be informed and then that should inform your decisions. So for instance, if you if you look at like something and you see that wow, black sounding names have an impact. That's why I probably wouldn't name my kid like Top Ramanika, right? But I need that information in order to be able to come to that conclusion. Likewise, we as a society can say, If this is happening such that people are being denied job opportunities, one, that gives us an explanation, right, for why maybe a portion of society isn't having the same outcomes as others, right? And it can also point us towards, are there other factors that are leading towards unfair hiring practices, or yes, right, that would probably result in these things. Furthermore, I think, like Nigerians, I can't be particularly bothered by people who are outside of the United States who are completely like ignorant about like the system that we have grown up in, that our country has grown up in, that has affected us, that is still impacting us today. And like if you're some outsider foreigner that doesn't know that history, I could totally see why you would say you're just making an excuse for yourself. If you're unaware of the harm that's happening to an individual, then that means any righteous complaint that the person has that is well founded will still just sound like an excuse to you until you can validate that excuse. And then at that point, that excuse begins to make more sense. And it's not just someone that's being feckless and unwilling to accept responsibility, but sometimes there is a system that's directly impacting them. I always go to one of the examples that I love to use, specifically with my mother. My mother is particularly successful, right? But that doesn't mean that the system didn't work very, very hard against her. My mother had to sue the Better Business Bureau. Had to go through the Better Business Bureau in order to sue the apartment complex in order for us to be able to get to where we would to live in the apartment that we were living in, because they were simply denying her because she was black. Now, this was in the early 90s, right? But this happened in my mother's lifetime. Then my mother had to go to school. And then when she was trying to transfer colleges to her master's degree, they were trying to deny her. Now, we can't say for sure that that was black, right? That was because she was black. But what we can say is the inheritance that was left to my mother from 3 years ago was impacted directly by the legislation that was passed regarding, what's it called? The Fair Housing Act, right? The house that my grandmother bought was prior to the Fair Housing Act's passing. So she wasn't able to buy that house in a white neighborhood. So she bought that house in a black neighborhood. She paid for it, and lived in it until the day she died 3 years ago. Right? So that house was left as an inheritance to my mother. That house matured significantly lower than the houses in the white neighborhoods and the houses in its white counterparts. So then that means that my mother's inheritance was directly impacted by legislation that this government, our country, had passed. So it's not just about making excuses. Now, I said all that to say that despite all of that, that my mother is still incredibly successful, has 2 different master's degrees, has her own private practice. She's retired literally about a month ago. So it's not like I'm using this as some sort of excuse to be able to justify my mother's fecklessness, because my mother's an incredibly determined woman. But I recognize that my mother had a specific thing in her that drove her to see herself better than her circumstances and to rise above. I know that not everyone has that. And so if we have factors and things in society that allow for people to discriminate and harm people, some people are going to fall by the wayside. And as a society, we should be making broader prescriptions for fixing things so that things are equal and equitable, while still recognizing that until those things go through, it's still the onus on every individual to be responsible for themselves and to make sure that their livelihood is something that they can live with and something that they aspire to, despite all of the opposition.
I got you. I don't think we're gonna see eye to eye on this topic, but to just make the point, when I make the comparison of other people in other countries, the point that I'm trying to make is America, we and I think Candace Owens said this, and I know people are gonna love this because I get compared to her all the time, is that Black Americans are the most privileged Black people. And I know of people that live in other countries that are still living in dirt houses, or they still don't have running water or electricity. And they look at people in America who are complaining about not getting a job because of their Black sounding name. Meanwhile, this person's living out somewhere trying to figure out where their next meal is coming from. So it's that where I think it's the lack of perspective that sort of is a slow drip to victimize people when there isn't a reason, because there are other people in worse situations that can bring themselves up out of poverty, but for some reason the system is preventing us, which by the way, the system affects everybody. The life is difficult regardless of who you are, and I've definitely had some tough times, but I've never once attributed my race as a reason for that. And of course I don't have a Black sounding name either. But yeah, I just think that it's a bad precedents to set is like, this is the reason, instead of just saying, okay, life sucks. I like to think of worst case scenarios, like life sucks, this is our situation, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to wait for the government to help us? Are we going to give more power to the government to help us? Or are we going to realize that we are responsible for ourselves on this planet and we got to do what we need to do to survive? That's how I look at it.
But you can do both of those simultaneously. Also, I think you're comparing apples to oranges. I think it's a little bit ridiculous to compare Americans and then set the bar so low as to compare us to, I don't know, in some third world country where people are living in abject poverty, and then say, well, you're doing better than them, so what are you complaining about? I think if you're living in America where we have this infrastructure and this government and this amount of opportunity, this is the greatest country in the world. So if we're living in the greatest country in the world, but we're seeing that these opportunities are being denied to us, I think we have every right to look at the government that claims to be equitable, that claims that all men are created equal, that claims that this is supposed to be the land of the free and that we're supposed to have all of these opportunities. And it's up for us to be able to hold that accountable. And I don't think looking and comparing to something like Nigeria does any benefit to us whatsoever. I think that's completely extraneous.
Well, I mean, doing the reparations will for sure make everyone say as though we're not equal because we're putting a dollar amount for your ancestors. So, but
No, 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 no,
I
no.
wanted to
I've never
ask
talked
you.
about ancestors. All of my reparations. First off, I've talked about the
Yeah, it
GI
was some
Bill. That's
reparations.
people living right now. When I talk about
Okay.
like redlining, that's people, or the redlining impacted my mother's inheritance. She's living today, right? So like I'm talking about things that are happening now. When we can look at things like reverse redlining, those are things that are impacting us today for people living today. I feel like a lot of times reparations discourse is sullied by the fact that people want to focus on the most nebulous form of reparations there is, which is slavery. When it's like, wait, as opposed to looking back 3, 4 generations, three in my case, or four in my case, three in others, instead of looking at those things, how about we just look at things that are impacting the lives of Americans today, right now, and say do reparations for those things?
So you're saying broadly just not black people, but just certain black people that have suffered from this.
Absolutely.
Because when I hear reparation, I say like, yeah, for black people for reparations, but when it sounds like with you, it's saying, well, it's people that are directly affected by this. So it's going to be certain black people.
Absolutely. I think reparations should be directly for the people who we can prove were impacted by the harm.
But it would be, but in that sense, would this be giving reparations to the descendants of people that were fell victim to slavery? Because no one alive was
I
actually
haven't
on a
mentioned slavery.
plantation.
I haven't mentioned
No, it's
slavery
talking
at
about
this entire
redlining.
And
time.
oh, redlining. Oh, okay,
Redlining.
I got you. I got you.
Redlining, the GI Bill, reverse redlining, the education system, the forced segregation, all of those things.
Okay.
No, I'm just trying to unpack it more because every time when I hear like reparations, just like broadly over a span just of all black people, but then it also talks about the messaging too. Because I'm really just because right now, I'll be real, like I hate the way racial tensions are now. And I guess it's warranted. Yeah, we have everything that's happened with BLM, and what I mostly see is just kind of like an anti-white rhetoric where it's kind of cool to hate white people. And if anything, I think right now is probably the best time to get a job if you're black because the way that if things are when it comes to media and companies, I really don't see them so much against us. If anything, like you have a current president. If you don't vote for me, you ain't black type shit. So it's just like I don't see us like as the enemy right now. But it's just I just wondering more about the messaging. Like, is it kind of like, hey, America's gonna here's this those that are directed. We're a little bit less racist now. So it's just I'm talking about like when it comes to the message because I don't think like culturally that will fix anything. But yeah, I can tell that you got something there. So
Yeah,
like
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so
I'm not trying to cut you off. I want you to finish your thought though.
no,
But
it's all good.
okay, I think the messaging is incredibly important because I think a lot of times, people, humans, we typically, if when we're expecting difficulty, some of us decide, okay, like I'm gonna grit my teeth and bear this, and I'm gonna get through it, and I'm gonna do it. Like you're already expecting the difficulty. But for some people, it can be incredibly discouraging to encounter some sort of difficulty and not understand where the difficulty is coming from and not be prepared for the difficulty and then to become defeated, right? I think when you point out, this is the way that the system works against you, so this is what you're going to have to do, right? Like that's just, I think that's an important thing, right? You do that with children all the time. For example, maybe you have a child who has special needs, right? Maybe he has autism or something like that. You can explain to that child, listen, these are your areas, or these are going to be your areas of strength, and here are your areas of difficulty. This is where you're going to have to work extra hard. This is not going to come as easy to you as it is to everyone else. So you're going to have to put in extra work. And that prepares that child to recognize, okay, this is what I'm going to have to do. It's not about belittling. It's about painting out a reality such that people understand the thing that we're up against. And if we now can start understanding what we're actually up against, then the government, whose job it is to try its best to make sure that we all have access to the great American dream and to equality, the government can then say, hey, now that we're aware of this problem, let's go ahead and do something about this problem. Because the first step to fixing a problem is acknowledging that it's there. I don't think that messaging is harmful.
When it comes to race, it's being now acknowledged all the damn time. Wait, what were you gonna say?
I was gonna circle back. I'm just trying to understand how redlining is hurting people today.
Okay, sure.
Can you help me understand that?
So there's all of these studies that are done, like some of them as recent as 2018, that have demonstrated that the places that were redlined, there has been no attenuance for the redlining factors. They're still incredibly disproportionately black. They're still incredibly disproportionately like underdeveloped, and some of those things. So like when you looked at these redlined neighborhoods, right? Mobility is not everything. It's not like everyone just decides like to up and leave. Like leaving and living outside of where your infrastructure is, which can be things like family, things can be just familiarity, school, your church, all of these things. Leaving away from those things incurs a cost. So then when you look at a community in which there's been this crazy harm, and now we're in a capitalist society, and I think capitalism is the best system in the world, but the cost of things have increased. But maybe you're only able to survive in some really impoverished area where the cost of living isn't as high. To just up and relocate is going to be incredibly difficult. There's all sorts of benefits from having your mother, like living in close proximity to your mother, her giving you a ride to school, or picking up your kids from work, picking up your kids from school, giving you a ride to work, babysitting for you, or whatever. Like there's all of these benefits that happen. And of course, just like maybe you live in a rent controlled area or whatever the freak, right? There's all these benefits that come from that. And so these people haven't left these neighborhoods. So they're still directly impacted by this, because we've seen there has been no attenuance to these neighborhoods. If you do something harmful that allows and promotes the development of one neighborhood and subverts the development of another, unless you do something to offset that disparaging treatment, then these things will forever be behind, and it will forever be complicated in that way. And so that's where we're still seeing impacts today. And last thing, when you look at the properties that were purchased during that time, a lot of times, 70% of people's wealth portfolios in this country are real estate. So if these people weren't able to obtain real estate during this time specifically, and we can trace it directly to redlining and their loans being denied, then that means now that these people will not be able to give the same advantages to their children, right? And so then their children are being raised in those situations. The point that I'm bringing up about my grandmother's neighborhood and the inheritance that she left my mother, that happened again 3 years ago. So like it's not like redlining just ended. And again, redlining was replaced by reverse redlining, which now the country has settled for hundreds of billions of dollars, right? Like they recognize that we've done wrong as a government. So if the government is able to acknowledge and recognize these wrongs, and the banks are having to settle to the tunes of billions of dollars, I feel like we can pretty safely say that there are still problems that are happening now that are impacting people's lives, that are living today. We don't have to trace their ancestors, that probably need some sort of reparation.
So, two things. Number one, I don't think the government gives a shit about us. I don't think they care about us. Black people, white people don't. I think
I agree.
There are some good politicians, but I think, especially right now, I think racism is a hot topic to sort of herd people in a certain direction. You kept mentioning equity. I don't think equity is going to be a solution. We're all going to be equally poor.
I meant equality. I'm sorry. I keep using the word
Okay.
equity. I mean equality.
Equality.
Sorry.
But going back to the redlining, this might sound insensitive, but I still fail to see how redlining hurts someone. Because if my perspective is, if this environment that I'm in is a bad environment and I'm not able to do certain things because of redlining, how bad do I want to get out of this situation? Where there's a will, there's a way. And I think, like you said, there are things that come at a cost. Absolutely. Like we're thinking right now about where to move if we need to go to like a red state, if the lockdowns keep getting crazy. And that cost would be me, unfortunately, leaving my family behind. but my ability to move around freely as a free American is more important than being locked up in my house. So I think that, to me, it comes to a choice where, what is it that you want to do? If this is really important to you, you're going to figure it out. You're going to save up your money. You're going to get that extra job, because then we can even go even back a little bit further and say, how did they get in that situation in the first place? If this neighborhood is so bad, how did they get here? Maybe it was that financial situation. Maybe it was perhaps they had kids out of wedlock and now they got too many kids they got to take care of. What can we do to fix that situation? And I think more layers of government saying, we'll help you, we'll help you, we'll help you, isn't actually training someone to get better. It's actually making them dependent on the government. Because I know a lot of people in my family that are incarcerated right now, that have grown up in the projects, grown up being gangbangers and living in areas like this, where it's like, some people in that family got out of poverty, were able to move out and succeed, but you'll have this anomaly within the family where they just don't get it, and they're a victim to their culture. And that's what I feel is happening when we keep saying, government, help us, help us, help us.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess you said a lot there. It's kind of hard to contend with, because it's this. I think we both agree that as individuals we are responsible, right? Like, and I think that we're talking past each other, because I'm focusing on systemic racism and institutional racism, and you're focusing on personal responsibility. These two things are entirely different topics.
I think they're the same. I think they're the
Wait,
same
what?
because
No. Wait,
I, I
oh, go ahead.
I think they're the same because I don't. The only form I would be open to hearing about more systemic racism, but the only form that I can confidently say is that in the universities where they're specifically saying, we're not going to take these Asian students, we're not going to take these white students because we need to reach a certain quota, or something like a diversity quota or something, I can confidently say, okay, that's systemic racism. I find that the word systemic racism is thrown around so loosely as an excuse for just not being resilient.
Okay, so that's a form of systemic racism that you believe is against whites and Asian people. Are you aware of any existing systemic racism against black people?
No, but I would love to hear it.
That's I don't know. I don't know. That sounds
And the reason that I say this, let me add something else to your noggin. The reason that I say this is, it's going back to what we were talking about the data. So, like, if you're talking about data and you're saying that, people aren't getting this job or getting this thing because of their black sounding names, that is like, that's, to me, that's inconclusive data, because there's still other factors that can go into why that is happening. So,
oh,
with
sure.
the
Then I can
with the
dismiss that
diversity
data that
quota,
you're
it's a
talking
little bit
about.
easier
But
to
I
sort
can
of.
no, because I can dismiss what you're talking about, because
Yeah,
there's so
go
many
ahead.
factors that go into, like, whether or not you get into school. Like, for example, if you're an athlete, that's going to give you probably a strong leg up, right? Like, those
Mhm.
kind of things start having big impacts. So your extracurricular activities, right? Those things have big impacts. So I mean, we can always like point to a possible explanation for why someone's not getting something that maybe a study didn't control for. Or it's probably better, I would say, to just assume that there's probably an actual, like, that the people who are running the studies are actually doing like their due diligence to make sure that they're controlling for the various things in order to come to the conclusion of what's happening. But what I've actually found, as a person who just recently studied this, because I debated this just honest character, I'm not going to say his name, is that what they're doing now, it's not necessarily just affirmative action based on race or anything like that when it comes to the way schools are accepting people. It's not about a race quota. What they're using now is called an adversity score, which does not consider race. What it considers are socioeconomic status, whether or not your school had enough AP classes, whether or not you came from a single parent household, whether or not you came from what the crime rates were in your area, and so on and so forth. And so then they're using that to weight against, or they're using that weight to determine if you were able to achieve certain things. Like maybe you had a 4.0 GPA, but your school didn't offer AP classes. Well, this other person might have had a 4.5 GPA, but to achieve a 4.0 GPA given those circumstances means that you far outperformed and outachieved that other person given your circumstances. So then they would will use those things in order to compensate. And those things don't matter about race, because obviously we're not entirely segregated, even though there's pretty heavy segregation. So a white person in those circumstances applying for that thing would still get the exact same score as a black person. It really just matters how much adversity you encountered and how much you overcame. And that's what they're using. They're not just using affirmative action. They haven't done it for quite some time.
Okay. Do you want anything to add to that?
No.
Okay. You seem exhausted from this topic.
No, I'm not. I'm just. It's a lot said.
It's a lot. It's a lot. I think I've said my piece on it. I got some stuff to think about. Hopefully, you got some stuff to think about.
For sure.
What I said. But I do want to get to some of the other topics.
Okay.
Because we are already at an hour and 20. How much time do you got, by the way? Do you got like the full 2 hours, or are you trying?
Yeah, I got 55 more minutes tops, but yeah. Got you.
Okay, cool. So all right. So you also said another thing that you wanted to talk about was and by the way, let me say this. Let me address chat, because chat's been kind of cuckoo for the past hour. I want to say two things. Number one, someone just commented that Fanatiq wins. That's the problem. That is the problem, is that people can't have conversation without it being a spectacle of who wins and who loses. The whole point of having a conversation is to come to an understanding of why someone believes a thing that they do, and then either you agree or agree to disagree. It's not about winning and losing, and that's why civil discourse, I think, is failing.
For sure. If I can piggyback off of that really quickly, the only reason I even know anything about adversity score is specifically because I had a conversation with someone in which they were saying that they were using affirmative action, whatever. It was a recent conversation less than a month ago. That conversation caused me to look into it, and then that's where I discovered this. A lot of times you need a conversation in order to even like increase the ideas or whatever, to contend with ideas. Without these sort of conversations, I wouldn't know. If it wasn't for me having other conversations, I wouldn't know half of the things that I do know. And likewise, I'm pretty sure you've learned like some of the things that you've learned from encountering like adversity. So I don't think it's a matter of winning or losing. It really is just sometimes a matter of getting the ideas, expressing them, coming into information, stopping to think about them, hopefully, like rewatching the content when you're done, and then like kind of going over and saying, okay, and seeing new points of views. That's what a real dialogue is about. It's not about a winner or a loser necessarily.